friends, welcome back to The Elevated Dose with me, your host, Carrie Ferrone. This podcast is where we talk about GLP-1s, metabolic health, and what actually happens in real bodies, without shame, without fear, and without diet culture getting in the way. Before we get into today's episode, a quick reminder. I'm sharing education based on my lived experience. I'm not a doctor, and this isn't medical advice. Always talk to your own provider about what's right for you. Today, we're talking about something I hear constantly from people on GLP-1s. I'm not hungry. Nothing sounds good, but I know I should eat. Eating on a GLP-1 can feel confusing in a way no one prepares you for. Hunger changes, appetite changes, food noise quiets, and you're left wondering, now what? In this episode, we're going to break down what GLP-1s actually do in the body, why calories matter, how diet culture made this harder than it needed to be, and how to fuel yourself in a way that supports fat loss, muscle, and long-term health without obsessing or panicking. If this is your first time here, you might want to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss future episodes. I talk about this stuff a lot, and we build on it over time. All right, let's get into it. Before we can talk about what to eat or what people are doing wrong, we have to understand what these medications actually do inside the body, because most of the confusion people experience comes from not understanding the mechanism. GLP-1 medications are not fat burners. They don't speed up your metabolism. They don't magically cause weight loss on their own. What they do is change regulation. GLP-1 is a hormone your body already produces. It plays a role in digestion, insulin release, and appetite signaling. The medication makes your body think it has more of the hormone all the time. That matters because GLP-1 affects multiple systems at the same time. It slows gastric emptying. Food stays in your stomach longer so you feel full faster and stay full longer. It improves insulin signaling. Your body handles blood sugar more smoothly with fewer spikes and crashes. For people with insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, this alone can be life-changing. And it acts on appetite centers in the brain, which is where food noise comes in. Food noise isn't hunger. It's not physical need. It's the constant mental chatter about food. Thinking about eating when you're not hungry, planning meals while you're eating, feeling pulled toward food even when your body doesn't need it. For a lot of people, especially those with obesity, insulin resistance, PCOS, or diabetes, food noise has been loud for years. It's been driving decisions, emotions, and behavior. GLP-1s turn the volume down. Maybe not completely off, just down. And when that happens, eating stops being urgent. Hunger becomes quieter. Fullness comes sooner, and suddenly, the way you've eaten your entire life doesn't work the same anymore. That's not a problem, but it is a transition. When appetite and food noise quiet down, most people assume eating should automatically get easier. But what often happens instead is that eating gets confusing because hunger isn't loud anymore. People start relying on it as their only cue, and since it's subtle, they eat less, sometimes much less. This isn't intentional restriction. It's not dieting. It's just responding to quieter signals without realizing that nutritional needs haven't changed. That's where unintentional undereating shows up. At first, it doesn't feel like a problem. The scale is moving, energy feels okay, everything seems fine, but the body keeps score. Hair loss often shows up a few months in because hair is one of the first things the body deprioritizes when caloric intake is too low. Fatigue creeps in, not dramatic exhaustion, but that low-grade tiredness that doesn't go away with sleep. Muscle loss accelerates, especially if someone isn't strength training or isn't eating enough calories and proteins to support lean tissue. Constipation becomes common because digestion is slower and people are often underhydrating and underfueling without realizing it. Sulfur burps and GI discomfort can happen because food sits longer in the stomach and meals aren't structured in a way that supports digestion. None of these things mean the medication is failing. They mean the body is being undersupported. On the other side, some people experience the opposite. They don't trust their new fullness cues. They eat past comfort because stopping feels scary, or they panic when hunger returns and assume something is wrong. Both reactions come from the same place. No one taught you how to eat in a regulated body. We have to talk about calories honestly because avoiding this conversation causes more harm than having it. Calories in versus calories out still matters. GLP-1s do not override basic biology. Weight loss requires a calorie deficit. What GLP-1s do is make a calorie deficit sustainable by reducing hunger and food noise and improving blood sugar regulation. But here's the critical part. A calorie deficit is not the same thing as eating as little as possible. Caloric needs are not identical across bodies. Obesity, insulin resistance, PCOS, and type 2 diabetes all affect how efficiently the body uses energy. Many people with these conditions have lived in a metabolically inefficient bodies for years. Muscle mass also plays a huge role. Muscle is metabolically active tissue. The more muscle you have, the more calories your body burns at rest. Lose muscle during weight loss, and your baseline energy needs drop, which makes maintenance harder later. This is why extreme undereating can actually work against long-term success. Yes, the scale may move faster in the short term, but the body adapts. Energy drops, muscle is lost, metabolism downshifts. A healthy calorie deficit, though, supports weight loss while still fueling the body enough to protect muscle, hormones, hair, and energy. That's the difference between weight loss that lasts and weight loss that rebounds. GLP-1s support that kind of deficit, not by eliminating the need for calories, but by reducing the chaos around calorie intake. When someone starts a GLP-1, the most important physiological change is not weight loss. It's a shift in how the body senses and responds to energy intake. But here's what almost no one explains clearly. The body does not experience eating less as neutral. It experiences it as a signal. And the signal the body responds to is not appetite, it's energy availability. Energy availability is the amount of usable energy the body has after digestion to support everything that is not optional for survival. That includes muscle maintenance, hormone production, immune function, brain function, and recovery. When energy availability drops below a certain threshold, the body adapts quietly, efficiently, without asking for permission. That adaptation does not start with weight regain. It starts with conservation. The body reduces energy expenditure where it can. Hair growth slows because hair is not essential. Reproductive hormones downshift because reproduction is not essential. Muscle protein synthesis decreases because muscle is metabolically expensive. These changes may not feel dramatic at first. That's why people miss them. Someone might be eating 800 to 1,000 calories a day on a GLP-1 without realizing it. They feel okay. Hunger is quiet. The scale is moving. Everything seems fine. But internally, the body is recalibrating. Hair follicles shift into a resting phase. You won't see that immediately. You'll see it 3 to 4 months later when shedding increases. Muscle tissue begins to break down at a slightly higher rate than it's rebuilt, especially if protein and carbohydrates are low. Resting energy expenditure suddenly decreases, not enough to show up on labs right away, but enough to slow progress later. Digestive motility slows further, which compounds constipation and increases gas production, especially sulfur-based gases when food sits longer in the gut. This is not a failure of the medication. It's a predictable physiological response to low energy availability. Dietitians are trained to recognize this pattern before it becomes a problem. They don't wait for hair loss. They don't wait for exhaustion. They don't wait for stalls. They look at intake relative to body size, sex, metabolic history, and activity level. They assess whether appetite suppression is aligned with nutritional adequacy or working against it. They also understand something most people don't. Hunger is no longer a reliable indicator of need on a GLP-1. So they teach eating based on planning and structure instead of hunger cues. That might mean eating on a loose schedule. That might mean smaller meals more frequently. It might also mean including foods that don't feel exciting but are physiologically necessary. This is not restriction, it's adaptation. Without the education, people oscillate. They undereat, feel awful, overcorrect, panic, then restrict again. The body never stabilizes. With education, intake stabilizes, symptoms resolve, and weight loss becomes slower, but safer and more durable. That's why dietitians aren't optional on this medication. They are preventative care. This is a good place to pause because everything we've talked about so far comes back to one thing. Most people on GLP-1s don't need more discipline. They need education and support. GLP-1s change how your body works. That means eating has to be relearned. That's one of the many reasons why I chose to use Fridays. Fridays is a telehealth platform that provides GLP-1 care. But what matters most to me is that registered dietitian support is built into that care. Dietitians help you set a healthy calorie deficit, eat enough without fear, protect muscle, manage side effects, and unlearn diet culture while still losing weight. If you're listening in real time, you can get $150 off your first month with code CARRY26. If you're listening later, use code DOSE. You can find all of that at www.theelevateddose.com along with my other trusted resources. All right, back to it. If you don't have the ability to access a dietitian, you need to figure out the food part of this journey on your own. So let's talk about what a healthy calorie deficit actually means in real life. A healthy deficit is not the biggest deficit you can tolerate. It's the smallest deficit that still produces steady progress without triggering conservation in the body. When intake drops too low, as we've talked about, the body adapts by lowering energy expenditure, increasing muscle breakdown, shifting hormone production. That's not willpower failure, that's survival biology. That is feast or famine at work. This is especially important for people with obesity, insulin resistance, PCOS, or type 2 diabetes. Those conditions already involve altered energy regulation. Resting metabolic rate can be lower than predicted. Hormone signaling is different. Muscle mass is often lower than ideal to begin with. That means two people at the same exact height, weight, and age can have very different calorie needs. This is why generic calorie targets fail so many people. Without a dietitian, the goal is not precision, it's awareness and adjustment. You're looking for a range where weight trends downward over weeks, not days. Energy is stable, workouts are sustainable, digestion isn't falling apart, hair, mood, and recovery aren't declining. If weight is dropping rapidly, but energy, strength, and recovery are deteriorating, that deficit is likely too aggressive. If weight is completely stagnant for several weeks and intake is consistent, the deficit may be too small or muscle loss may be masking fat loss. This is where macros come in, not as rules, but as context. Protein needs to be sufficient to support lean mass. On a GLP-1, that usually means prioritizing protein because total intake is lower. This isn't necessarily about chasing a number, it's about protecting tissue while weight is changing. Carbohydrates provide fuel. They support brain function, training performance, and recovery. When carbs are too low, fatigue, brain fog, and exercise intolerance show up fast, especially on a medication that already suppresses your appetite. Fat supports hormones and satiety. Too little fat makes intake unstable and can worsen constipation and hormonal disruption. None of these exist in isolation. A calorie deficit with inadequate protein increases muscle loss. A deficit with inadequate carbs worsens fatigue and training performance. A deficit with inadequate fat destabilizes appetite and hormones. That's why macros matter inside the deficit, not instead of it. And here's the part people don't necessarily expect. A healthy deficit at the beginning of a GLP-1 journey is not the same deficit later. As weight decreases, calorie needs change. As activity increases, needs change again. As muscle mass improves, you got it, calorie needs change. As you move toward maintenance, everything shifts. What worked at 240 pounds will not work at 180 pounds. What worked during early appetite suppression may not work once hunger cues return more normally. This is why calorie targets and macros have to be monitored and adjusted over time. Not constantly or obsessively, but intentionally. Because if nothing ever changes, the body will adapt around it. This is where people get frustrated and think the medication stopped working, when really their intake no longer matches their body's output. Without guidance, people tend to respond by eating less instead of recalibrating. That's how diet culture sneaks back in, and that's why this conversation matters. Because when you don't understand how deficits, macros, and adaptation work, eating starts to feel dangerous again, which brings us exactly to the next part. Diet culture didn't just give us bad rules, it taught us to fear adjustment. It taught us that changing course meant failure, and that belief is what makes this journey harder than it needs to be. If you need help figuring out your calorie deficit and macros, you can try your favorite food tracking app or tdeecalculator.net. Diet culture didn't just give people bad advice about food, it rewired how we interpret signals from our own bodies. That's important to understand because if you think diet culture is just a mindset problem, you'll keep trying to think your way out of patterns that are actually physiological and neurological. Most people who have lived with obesity, insulin resistance, PCOS, or type 2 diabetes didn't diet once or twice. They dieted repeatedly, often for years or decades, and every one of those cycles taught the body something. Here's what the body learned. When food intake drops and weight decreases, dopamine is released. The brain experiences that as a reward. So restriction becomes reinforced, not because it feels good, but because it leads to an outcome the brain has been taught to value. At the same time, hunger increases cortisol. Hunger is uncomfortable, stressful, and often framed as failure. So the brain learns that hunger is a threat that needs to be controlled. Over time, this creates a conditioning loop. Eating less feels safer, hunger feels dangerous, control feels protective. This isn't a character flaw. This is how learning works in the nervous system. Now layer medical messaging on top of that. Many people with metabolic diseases were told, explicitly or implicitly, that their bodies could not be trusted, their appetite was broken, that carbs were dangerous, that weight loss required constant vigilance. So food stops being neutral input and starts being interpreted as risk. That's the trauma piece people don't talk about clearly or often enough. Trauma doesn't mean dramatic events only. Trauma also means repeated exposure to stress without resolution. Diet culture is exactly that. Every time you eat, your nervous system is asked to evaluate danger. Every time hunger shows up, your brain scans for loss of control. Every fluctuation becomes evidence for or against your worth or safety. GLP-1s change appetite signaling, but they do not automatically undo this conditioning. In fact, they can temporarily make it louder because hunger quiets and the nervous system loses a familiar signal it used to monitor constantly. Even though that signal was distressing, it was predictable. When it disappears, the brain doesn't relax. It asks, how do I know I'm safe now? This is why people on GLP-1s often feel anxious about eating even when food noise is gone. They don't trust fullness, they don't trust hunger returning, they don't trust days where their intake is higher. Everything feels fragile because diet culture taught them that weight loss is fragile. So moving away from diet culture is not about not caring or pretending calories don't exist. It's about changing how the brain interprets food-related information. Here's what that actually looks like in practice. The first step is separating biology from morality. Calories are units of energy. Macros are categories of nutrients. Weight is a data point, not a report card. None of these things say anything about your discipline, your worth, or whether you're doing life correctly. Diet culture collapses all of that into judgment. Moving away from it requires deliberately pulling those things apart again. The second step is replacing reactive eating rules with proactive structures. This is where people can get tripped up because structure gets mislabeled as diet culture. But there's a difference between punitive structure and supportive structure. Punitive structure exists to control outcomes. Supportive structure exists to meet needs. Because on a GLP-1, hunger is not a reliable driver anymore, relying on hunger alone often leads to undereating. Moving away from diet culture sometimes means eating before hunger, not waiting for it. And that can feel wrong because diet culture taught us that eating without hunger is dangerous. But physiologically, eating proactively on this medication is often what stabilizes energy, digestion, and mood. The third step is reframing, tracking, and monitoring. Tracking became traumatic for many of us because it was used as a judgment system. You were good if the numbers were low enough, you were bad if they weren't. Moving away from diet culture doesn't require abandoning tracking. It requires changing what tracking is for. Tracking becomes a way to answer questions like, am I eating enough to support my activity? Is my intake consistent enough to avoid underfueling? Do certain days need more food than others? It stops being a tool for control and becomes a tool for calibration. The fourth step is normalizing variability. Diet culture taught us that consistency means sameness. Same intake, same output, same scale number, day after day after day. Biology doesn't work that way. Your energy needs change with stress, sleep, hormones, illness, and activity. Hunger fluctuates, weight fluctuates, intake fluctuates. Moving away from diet culture means allowing that variability without interpreting it as failure. A higher calorie day is not a threat. Hunger returning is not a relapse. A stall is not a moral failing. They're all normal physiological occurrences in a living body. And finally, the last step is rebuilding trust slowly. Trust is not a mindset shift, it's a pattern recognition process. The brain learns safety by seeing that nothing bad happens when you eat enough. It learns safety by seeing that hunger returning doesn't cause loss of control. It learns safety by seeing that consistency matters more than perfection, and that takes time. GLP-1s create the physiological conditions where this relearning is possible, but the relearning still has to happen. That's why diet culture can't just be ignored. It has to be actively replaced with education, structure, and repetition. Because the goal isn't to eat less forever. The goal is to eat in a way that your body doesn't have to fight anymore. When people start a GLP-1 and feel tired, weaker, or less motivated to move, they usually assume one of two things. Either the medication is doing this to them, or this is just what weight loss feels like. Neither of those explanations is fully accurate. What's actually happening is a mismatch between energy demand and energy availability. Exercise, especially strength training, creates a very specific kind of demand on the body. It's not just burning calories, it's signaling. When you lift weights or do resistance-based movement, you're sending a message to your body that says, this tissue matters, keep it. That message only gets acted on if the body has the resources to respond. Muscle is expensive. It requires energy to maintain and even more energy to repair after training. If energy availability is low, the body makes a trade-off. It prioritizes survival systems over muscle preservation and repair. That doesn't mean all muscle disappears overnight. It means the balance quietly shifts. Slightly more muscle is broken down than rebuilt. Recovery slows, strength gains stall. Over time, lean mass can decrease. This matters more than people realize because muscle isn't just about aesthetics or strength. Muscle is one of the largest drivers of resting energy expenditure. It's metabolically active tissue. The more muscle you have, the more energy your body uses at rest. So when muscle is lost during weight loss, the body's baseline calorie needs decrease. That's one of the main reasons people experience plateaus and regain later. Strength training is protective against that, but only if it's paired with adequate fuel. This is where a lot of people on GLP-1s get stuck. Appetite is low, hunger is quiet, so intake drops. People are still exercising, or they start exercising because they want to do this right, but they don't adjust intake to match the new demand. From the body's perspective, that's a double stressor. Energy in goes down, energy out goes up. The body responds by conserving. That conservation shows up as fatigue, slower recovery, and sometimes the feeling that exercise just isn't worth it anymore. Now let's talk about fuel because this is where diet culture did the most damage. Protein, carbohydrates, and fat all play distinct roles in supporting exercise and recovery. None of them are optional. Protein provides the building blocks for muscle repair. Without enough protein, the body cannot effectively rebuild tissue after training. That's straightforward. But protein alone does not fuel muscle. Carbohydrates are the primary fuel source for resistance training and for the central nervous system during effort. Muscle glycogen, which comes from carbohydrates, is what allows you to lift, push, and recover efficiently. When carbohydrate intake is too low, glycogen stores are depleted. The brain perceives effort as harder. Coordination suffers, motivation drops, workouts feel heavier than they should. This isn't weakness, it's physiology. Protein cannot replace glycogen. In low energy states, protein gets diverted to meet energy needs instead of being used for repair. That's how people can eat enough protein and still lose muscle. That plays a quieter but equally important role. Dietary fat supports hormone production, including estrogen and testosterone, which influence muscle maintenance, recovery, and overall energy levels. Fat also contributes to satiety, which helps stabilize intake across the day. When fat intake is too low, eating becomes erratic. People feel full quickly, but hungry again shortly after, or they feel satisfied physically but mentally unsettled. On a GLP-1, these signals are harder to interpret because appetite is blunted. That doesn't mean the need disappears. This is where relying on hunger alone breaks down. Appetite suppression makes it easy to underfuel unintentionally. People don't feel like they're starving, so they assume that their intake is fine. Meanwhile, their body is operating below what is needed to support training, recovery, and daily function. This is why fueling on a GLP-1 often needs to be intentional rather than intuitive, at least for a short period of time. That might mean eating before a workout even if you're not hungry. It might mean including carbohydrates even when diet culture has taught you that you shouldn't. It might mean prioritizing meals that feel boring but physiologically supportive. That's not failure, that's adaptation. Another important piece here is timing. Because gastric emptying is slower on a GLP-1, very large meals can feel uncomfortable and interfere with training. Smaller, more evenly distributed meals often work better, especially around workouts. This is not about maximizing performance, it's about avoiding underfueling while respecting how digestion has changed. When fueling is aligned with training demand, a few important things happen. Energy and recovery improve. Strength stabilizes or increases, and weight loss becomes less chaotic. The body no longer feels like it has to choose between losing weight and preserving tissue, and this is the part people rarely hear. Strength training is not something you add after weight loss. It is part of how you lose weight well. It protects muscle, it supports insulin sensitivity, it raises the floor of your metabolism. But none of that works if eating is driven by fear. Diet culture taught us that exercise earns food or cancels it out. That framing makes fueling feel optional or indulgent. Physiology says the opposite. Exercise increases the need for fuel. Fuel determines how the body adapts. When you pair strength training with adequate protein, carbohydrates, and fat, even in a calorie deficit, you create the conditions for sustainable fat loss instead of tissue loss. That's the difference between shrinking and rebuilding, and that difference matters long after the scale stops moving. So if eating on a GLP-1 has felt confusing, frustrating, or way more complicated than you expected, I want you to hear this part clearly. Nothing is wrong with you. Your body changed. How it experiences hunger, fullness, digestion, and energy changed. And most people were never given the education to change with it. GLP-1s don't teach you how to eat. They don't undo diet culture. They don't magically repair decades of fear-based messaging around food, carbs, calories, or control. They create the physiological opportunity for you to do that work, but the work still has to be learned. Eating enough matters. Calories still matter. Protein, carbs, and fat are important. Strength training is critical. And letting go of diet culture does not mean letting go of structure, education, or accountability. It means replacing punishment with understanding. It means moving from control to care. And that shift doesn't happen overnight. It happens with support, repetition, and better information than most of us were ever given. If this episode helped you understand your body a little bit more, or helped you feel like you're not doing it wrong, I'd really appreciate you taking a moment to support the show. Make sure you're subscribed to the Elevated Dose so you don't miss future episodes. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, leave a 5-star review. It helps this podcast reach people who are exactly where you might have been a few months ago, confused, overwhelmed, and trying to do their best. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, share this episode with them. Not as advice, just as reassurance that they're not alone in this. If you're looking for trusted GLP-1 care with real nutrition support, including access to registered dietitians, you can find everything I recommend at www.theelevateddose.com. That's where I keep my elevated essentials, including Fridays. You don't need more rules. You don't need to be stricter. You don't need to earn food. You need education, support, and time. I'm really glad you were here today. I'll see you next episode.